Hey guys, tonight we tumble headfirst into the gloriously absurd world of Tudor table manners because nothing screams bedtime, like wondering whether your soup spoon could spark a scandal. Picture this candlelight flickering off pewter goblets, the aroma of roast swan, in a hall full of nobles trying very hard not to chew too loud. You're not just attending dinner tonight, you're navigating a high-stakes social ballot where one wrong slurp might cost you your head, literally. You probably won't survive this, so before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're up for it, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see where our little sleep-deprived history club is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The announcement comes with a trumpet fanfare. Yes, really. You've just been summoned to the Great Hall for supper, which in Tudor England is less of a meal and more of a ritual, with roughly the same chill factor as a job interview. Everyone rises from their cushioned wooden stools, zeros if they're lucky enough to have one, brushing off their sleeves and trying to remember which hand goes where. You're nervously fixing your doublet, wondering if it's too early to fake a stomachache. The stewards have been bustling about for at least an hour already. They've laid down rushes on the floor, soft bundles of herbs and grasses that soak up spills and mask the smell of, well, centuries of people. Remember, this is before Febreze. You walk carefully. It's a bit like stepping through a wildflower carpet. If that carpet had been trodden on by muddy boots and a few wandering chickens. Now here's where it gets weird. You don't just wander in and find a seat. Oh no. First, you line up by rank, literal social rank, not like a conga line at a wedding. If you're low status, you'll be at the back, maybe even standing in the hallway hoping someone forgets to show up. If you're born, you're escorted in with pomp, and a few flourishes of your embroidered sleeves, past trestle tables already groaning with trenchers. Those thick slabs of stale bread used as edible plates. Historians still argue whether the full spectacle of Tudor dining was more about power display or actual nourishment. But one thing's clear, this was theater, and everyone had a role to play. As you approach the hall, the first hurdle is the doorman. Yes, there's a doorman for dinner. He checks that you're expected, properly dressed, and not visibly tipsy. One wrong belt buckle, and it's, sorry, no soup for you. And then there's the seating chart, which, let's be honest, would make even a bridezilla blush. The high table, perched on a raised dais at the end of the hall, is where the host sits flanked by the most important guests. The closer you are to this center of power, the more likely you are to get decent food, warm meat, and not be trampled by a serving boy. Just imagine trying to explain this setup to your modern friends. No, I didn't sit next to the host. I was 4 elbows past the salt. Because yes, there's a literal dividing line made by a salt cellar that we'll get into in the next section. But even before that, your entry is a performance. You nod to the steward. You bow, not too deep, not too quick. You slide into your assigned place with a grace that hides the fact you've already forgotten which hand you're supposed to eat with. That's fine. No one started yet. You're still waiting for the official prayer. Oh, right. There's a pre-meal prayer. Loud, long, and loaded with Latin. You stand for it. Hands clean, Ella, we hope. You'll be washing them publicly in a bit, and try not to shuffle from foot to foot. Behind you, someone's stomach growls. It's probably yours. You eye the roast peacock on the table, its feathers intact and glimmering like a Renaissance drag queen. A quirky tidbit for you. Sometimes these grand feasts featured subtleties, which were elaborate sugar sculptures between courses. Think dragons breathing candied fire or edible castles filled with jelly knights. They weren't to eat, mind you, more like table decoration meets flex. Your job? Pretend you're impressed. Don't poke it. And definitely don't sneeze on it. And speaking of jobs, let's not forget the army of servants orchestrating this whole shebang. Pages, carvers, cupbearers. It's like Downton Abbey, but with more venison and a slightly higher risk of plague. Each role is specialized. You're expected to stay in your lane. Want to pour your own drink? Absolutely not. That's the cupbearer's domain. And if you so much as touch the jug, prepare for some serious side eye. So here you are, finally seated, surrounded by the clatter of knives. No forks yet, remember. The rustle of linen, and the whispered panic of your neighbor, realizing he forgot to bow to the lady opposite him. It's dinner time, Tudor style, and so far you've survived. Barely. Your seat, dear sleeper, is more than just a spot to park your noble derriere. It's your entire somme in carved oak and elbow room. The Tudors, ever obsessed with hierarchy, treated seating arrangements like sacred scripture. One misplaced backside, and suddenly you're mistaken for a baron when you're barely a gentleman. And trust me, nobody wants to be caught slumming it above their station in front of a roast goose. You glance left, then right. If you're seated up near the high table, congrats, you're either important or someone made a clerical error. The high table is elevated literally and figuratively. It's where the host or lord of the manor holds court, flanked by honored guests, often with a gloriously embroidered cloth draping just so. Your job, should you land in such rarefied air, is simply be charming, eat politely, and above all, pretend you're used to this. But let's say you're not at the high table. You're further down the hall, maybe in the dreaded, below the salt zone. Yes, this is a real thing. The salt cellar, often an ornate chunk of silver or gold, marks the invisible line between the elite and, well, everyone else. Above the salt, you're among the glitterati. Below it, you're practically ornamental. Here's a quirky fact to salt your brain with. Salt itself was a luxury item, essential for preserving meat and seasoning food. Its place on the table wasn't just culinary, it was symbolic. So your proximity to that sparkly little mound, directly tied to how valuable you were seen in the eyes of your host. Close enough to sprinkle it, you're golden. Far enough that you're squinting to spot it. Better keep your elbows tucked and mouth shut. Historians still argue whether the salt division was a rigid rule at every meal or more of a general tradition, but guests took it seriously. Seating plans were pre-approved, sometimes written down, and occasionally even fought over. The wrong placement could result in bruised egos, or worse, whispered gossip over pies and pasties. And speaking of bruised egos, if you're a guest who tries to bump up a seat or sneak a better view of the roast pheasant, beware. The steward's watching. He knows where you're meant to be. Everyone knows. And if you disrupt the flow, there's no formal punishment. But the social side? You'll endure could freeze boiling broth at your table, assuming you're mid-tier noble or aspiring courtier. You'll probably be sharing space with 3 to 5 others. There's no one plate, one person situation here. Instead, welcome to the world of shared trenchers. These thick slices of stale bread act as communal plates. And yes, they're reused. Your half of the trencher is technically yours. But don't lean over too far. You might catch a whiff of your neighbor's pottage, or, worse, his perfume. The vibe is crowded. Elbows bump. Sleeves drag. You're intensely aware of where everyone else's hands are. The trick is to stay compact, like a polite origami version of yourself, all while exuding courtly charm. Now, imagine this. You're seated across from someone far above you in social rank. Say, a knight or even, heavens, a lady in waiting. You're not just expected to keep quiet, you're also supposed to make them look good. Nod at the right stories, laugh softly at the right jokes, and definitely don't interrupt. It's like being a living, breathing laugh track, but with worse food. And there's another layer of etiquette nightmares. Let's say you're invited to a royal feast, King Henry V style. The seating here is less dinner party, more geopolitical chessboard. Foreign ambassadors, nobles, mistresses, a plural of, all slotted in with meticulous strategy. You sit too close to someone of rival allegiance, and congratulations. You've just started a diplomatic incident over boiled parsnips. To add pressure, seating signals future prospects. If the queen's cousin gets seated closer to the monarch this week, you can bet courtiers are whispering about favor gained, and rumors swirling faster than the gravy boat. Sometimes, an entire career hinged on who was seated or during a single banquet. And yet, it's not all anxiety. If you play your cards right, defer to the right people, drop a clever line without overstepping, you might inch your way up the table next time. That's the Tudor game, survive dinner, win status. Like a medieval LinkedIn, but with more grease and fewer endorsements. There's something deeply theatrical about it all. The way servants sweep in, the careful choreography of who sits where, the unspoken rules that everyone just knows. And you, new to this world, are absorbing it by the second. Your ears pick up on names, alliances, even the subtle shifting of chairs that means someone of real importance has just entered. All without a word being spoken. Remember that napkin on your lap. We'll get into its twisted etiquette in a bit. But for now, just keep your hands clean, your posture perfect, and your eyes down unless spoken to. You've made it to the table. Staying there, that's the real challenge. Now that you're seated, elbows tucked, and sweating mildly under the judgmental gaze of 1,000 candle flames, your eyes catch something gleaming dead center on the table. No, it's not a jewel or a gilded goblet. It's the salt. The great salt, to be precise. And it's not just sitting there for seasoning. This little pile of crystals, often housed in an ornate, sometimes towering silver salt cellar, is basically a glittering signpost screaming, hierarchy lives here. Tudor feasts revolved, quite literally, around this salt. Picture it as the medieval equivalent of a velvet rope in a VIP lounge. Only the cool, powerful, or socially untouchable sat above it. You? Depends on whether your last name starts with Sir, or I hope they have leftovers. The salt didn't just sit there being salty. It was deliberately placed center of the high table, or at the midpoint of the most honored row, so that everyone knew exactly who was who. Above the salt meant access to the finer cuts of meat, the juicier gossip, and the warmth of the fire. Below the salt, you got stringy mutton, lukewarm broth, and the occasional whiff of someone's damp hose. You glance around nervously, making sure you're not ogling the salt too long. Because here's the kicker. Just because you can see it doesn't mean you should. Staring too long at the great salt could be taken as social climbing, the dining equivalent of sneakily sniffing a royal's goblet. Here's your mainstream historical fact for the night. Salt was so valuable, in Tudor times, that it wasn't just a food additive, it was a symbol of wealth, trade power, and preservation might. The phrase, worth your salt, comes from this era and reflects how essential and prized the substance was, especially before refrigeration made things less fatal. And then there's the bread. Not just for munching. No, it's a message. You're a piece of manchit, that's fine white bread. Dear sleeper is a status symbol in its own right. The whiter and softer it is, the more important you are. The rougher, browner loaves, reserved for the lower ranks, who'd probably have to use them as trenchers anyway. Those sturdy, edible plates we discussed earlier. Bread wasn't just eaten. It was respected. You'd break it carefully, share it if etiquette dictated, and never, ever toss it. Tossing bread, especially if you're seated anywhere above the salt, could be seen as a spiritual insult. After all, bread represented Christ's body to many Tudors, an extra layer of holiness sprinkled atop your supper. But you know what was fair game to toss? Apple cores, bones, gristle. The floor beneath the table was often strewn with rushes, herbs, and whatever discards your manners couldn't quite tame. It sounds gross, and, well, it was. But it was also surprisingly common, even in the grandest halls. You just had to know what was okay to chuck and what might earn you a stern glare from the steward. It's a hint if it once had feathers, it probably shouldn't end up underfoot. A quirky tidbit, some particularly extravagant hosts used swan or peacock feathers to decorate the salt cellars. One 16th century banquet even featured a sculpted salt tower with tiny banners and moving parts. Historians still argue whether these elaborate salt sculptures were widespread or just extreme flexes by royalty, but they certainly left an impression, especially if one collapsed mid-toast. Now, while your stomach might be growling and your fingers itching to reach for that bread, slow down. The first course hasn't even begun. What you're seeing laid out, bread, salt, maybe a bit of cheese, is part of the void or pre-meal phase. Think of it as the Tudor version of a charcuterie board, minus the Instagramming. You're allowed to nibble carefully, daintily, but the real feasting hasn't started. That won't happen until the hand washing. But we'll save that gem for the next section. Back to your table. You notice now that even the arrangement of items follows rules. The trenchers are spaced evenly. Salt is always placed with fanfare. Drinking vessels, likely pewter or pottery for your class, are pre-filled, not by you, of course, but by servants who've memorized more etiquette than most lawyers. You wouldn't dare pour your own drink. It's not just rude, it's suspicious. What are you doing trying to poison yourself? You sip from your cup when allowed, small sips, none of that loud glugging nonsense. One man at a previous feast gulped too eagerly and hiccuped through the Lord's Prayer. He hasn't been invited back. Meanwhile, over at the high table, a servant places a fresh salt mound in a golden dish shaped like a miniature ship. It glints in the candlelight. Everyone pretends not to notice. No one says a word, but you all know the queen herself is arriving. She doesn't sit right away. First, she stands behind her chair as the entire room goes quiet. So quiet you can hear the fire pop. She nods once, then lowers herself gracefully, her skirts whispering secrets as they settle. Only then do you all sit, and the feast can truly begin. Just as your backside begins to mold comfortably into the hard bench, and your nostrils adjust to the fragrant blend of roasted game and rushes underfoot, a ripple runs through the hall. It's not food that comes next. No. First comes a surprisingly solemn spectacle, the public hand washing. Now, you might think, cool, hygiene! But don't get too modern on me. This isn't about germs. It's about ceremony, symbolism, a ritual of purity performed with all the gravitas of a royal wedding. And yes, everyone is watching. A servant approaches the high table first, carrying a basin shaped like a shallow dish with a wide rim, followed by another bearing a pitcher of warm, scented water. Rosewater if you're lucky. If not, maybe something that once passed near a citrus fruit. Either way, it smells fancier than you do. The highest ranking person is first. The water is poured slowly over their hands, which are held over the basin with a practiced grace. A third servant steps in, offering a folded linen towel so fine it could double as window dressing in a palace nursery. Dab, not scrub, dry just enough to suggest you're more angel than farmer. Then the ritual repeats, table by table, working its way down through the nobility. If you're sitting toward the back, you wait, and wait. And finally, a slightly damp cloth makes its way to you, along with tepid water that smells faintly of everyone else who's washed before you. Delightful. Still, you go through the motions, because this isn't about being clean. It's about showing that you know the rules. And yes, it is public. People are watching, judging. Your grip on the towel, the daintiness of your fingertips, the angle of your wrists, it's all on display. Botch it, and you risk whispers. Get it right, and maybe someone important notices your impeccable pinkies. Here's a mainstream historical fact to ponder as you pat dry. The practice of hand-washing before meals in the Tudor period had roots in monastic and royal traditions, often linked to spiritual cleanliness. The idea wasn't just to remove dirt, but to symbolically prepare oneself for receiving sustenance, especially in noble circles where dining approached divine ritual. And while that's noble in theory, let's not ignore the weirdness. Because the water you're washing in, it's reused. The same basin for multiple hands. Unless you're royalty, in which case a fresh basin might appear. Silver, plated, of course. The rest of you, it's communal rinse time. So try not to think about that night 3 seats over who just came in from hawking. Now, an odd little tidbit for you sometimes. The hand-washing water was so perfumed that it left your fingers sticky, which was counterproductive. But nobody dared complain, lest they be branded uncouth. Instead, nobles would casually rub their hands on their hose beneath the table. Or better yet, on the rushes below. Nature's original wet wipe. Historians still argue whether these public washings were more about piety or performance. Some suggest they were influenced by the growing influence of the church, while others argue it was just another layer of aristocratic theater. Either way, you've got damp fingers, and the scent of rosewater mingles with the aroma of boar stew. With the last dab of the communal towel, you signal your readiness. The feast is about to commence in earnest, but the washing does something else too. It sharpens your focus. You're clean, sort of, present, and more than a little hungry. Then come the grace prayers, long in Latin and usually delivered in a drone that could lull even the most pious listener into a light food coma. Your job? Bow your head. Keep it there. Do not open your eyes, scratch your nose, or look at the food like a starving raccoon. Once the final amen echoes off the vaulted ceiling, a gentle sigh of anticipation washes over the room. You sit up straighter. Servants begin moving again, now like dancers in a coordinated routine. Platters glide in, silver covers lifted with a flourish. The first course is served, and it's complicated, not just in flavor, though the Tudors did love their spice, but in arrangement. Dishes are placed on the table in a specific pattern symmetrically, with care, often mirroring the social order of the guests. If you're expecting to simply grab what looks good, think again. You wait. You must be offered. Nothing comes to you unless it's passed by someone of the right status. Trying to reach across for that honey? Glazed quail? Unthinkable. Instead, a steward will offer it, and you must either accept with a nod or decline with a murmured, "No thank you." But don't be too eager. Too many acceptances in a row, and you'll be branded gluttonous. You watch others first. Observe how they tilt their heads in polite refusal, how they take small portions, how they never pile their trenchers high. You mimic, as best you can, wondering how anyone actually eats with all these unwritten rules. A carver steps up to the high table. This man is a professional. He doesn't just slice meat, he performs. With flourishes and practiced knife work, he dissects a roast swan with a precision that would make a surgeon blush. You're not sure if you're supposed to clap or just sit in awe. The aroma wafts your way, heavy with spice and fire. Your stomach groans. Someone notices. They smile. A kind smile. Maybe you're not completely hopeless at this. So you sit, slightly damp, slightly stiff, and just a little dazzled. You've washed, you've waited, and now, the real eating begins. Just as your stomach prepares to celebrate its first real bite of Tudor cuisine, the next great danger of the evening looms. Conversation. Or rather, the treacherous etiquette of when you're allowed to talk, how you should talk, and what on earth you should be talking about while trying not to slurp your stew. Let's get one thing straight. If you're the chatty type, you're going to struggle. Tudor table manners dictate that silence is golden, unless, of course, you're someone very important or have been directly addressed. Otherwise, your background noise with a napkin. This rule isn't just about being polite, it's about maintaining the hierarchy. The lord at the high table might be discussing politics with a bishop. Meanwhile, 3 tables down, You're still trying to remember if it's gotch to butter your bread with your thumbs it is. Jumping in with a joke about turnips. Social suicide. Instead, you must master the art of the murmur-decide. Think, whisper, level commentary shared only with your immediate neighbor. Even then, choose your words carefully. You're expected to stick to light, non-controversial topics. No religion, no politics. And definitely no commentary on Lady Cecily's third helping of capon. Historians still argue whether Tudor dining etiquette genuinely discouraged conversation across the table, or if this was more common in particularly formal settings, like royal courts or aristocratic banquets. Regardless, the written guides from the era, of which there are more than you'd expect, stress, restraint, humility, and very well timed compliments. And heaven help you if you speak with food in your mouth. Not only is it rude, it's considered animalistic. This isn't just about class, it's about humanity. You're here to embody virtue and control, not to moo over your mutton. There's a popular conduct book from the late 1500s. The Baby's Book, charmingly named, that includes gems like, "Do not sniff the neighbor's cup, nor hold meat in thine open palm as if it were a bribe." These were actual tips, meaning someone once did these things. You try to think of something neutral to say. Perhaps a comment on the quality of the spice mix in the pottage. No, too specific. What if the host hears and thinks you're being sarcastic? Better to nod approvingly at your neighbor's perfectly folded napkin. Safe, predictable, boring. A quirky tidbit for you. In some noble households, particularly strict ones, guests were expected to memorize portions of scripture or Latin poetry to recite quietly if conversation stalled. Imagine choking down your goose pie while quoting Virgil. Not exactly small talk, but it did keep things quiet and spiritually uplifting, apparently. The strangest rule, you're not allowed to laugh loudly. Chuckling, maybe. A discreet titter. Acceptable. But any sound above the volume of a softly dying squirrel. Inappropriate. The Tudors were deeply suspicious of loudness at the table. It was seen as disorderly, a sign of poor breeding, or worse, French. You watch the high table for cues. A knight leans over to murmur something to a duchess. She smiles faintly, then says something so softly even the napkins can't hear it. This, you learn, is the goal, to participate in social ritual without disturbing the solemnity of the meal. Then, of course, there's the problem of being spoken to. If someone of higher rank addresses you, you're supposed to respond, but humbly. Make eye contact. Yes, briefly. Speak clearly? Certainly. Offer opinions, only if you want to gamble with social oblivion. Mostly your job is to agree, then gracefully steer the conversation back to them. You are the echo, not the song. And if no one talks to you at all, well, that's fine. You can always busy yourself with your trencher, your napkin, or the art of cutting a pear silently. That, too, is a kind of status, being invisible enough not to offend. Let's not forget the lurking presence of the host. Their ears are everywhere. If they sense too much chatter or, worse, laughter drifting down the table, you might get the look. One flick of their heavily ringed hand, and suddenly you're on drink, pouring duty for the rest of the meal. Not exactly a promotion. So you sit in a semi-reverent hush, occasionally nodding, occasionally sipping, and generally pretending you're much more comfortable than you are. And slowly you begin to realize that this silence, this careful restraint, it has a rhythm of its own. It forces you to observe, to listen, to appreciate, not just the food but the pageantry, the symmetry of movement, the music of clinking goblets and quiet footsteps on stone. You begin to see why people did this. Not just to eat, but to participate in something greater than hunger. And yet you miss your modern kitchen, your sandwich dinners, the freedom to belch without consequence. Still, for now, you hold your tongue, keep your thoughts bland, and offer a polite smile to the man beside you who just sneezed into his sleeve. That, at least, seems safe. As your hands hover awkwardly over the shared trenchers and your tongue debates whether to compliment the pottage again. Your eyes drift downward to the napkin on your lap. Or rather, the line and square that's somewhere between accessory, status symbol, and possibly a trap. Welcome to the delicate world of Tudor napkin etiquette, where folding fabric could spell your social triumph or your utter ruin. First off, the Tudor napkin isn't just a napkin, it's a declaration, a signal, a pre-meal origami test designed to separate the genteel from the uncouth. You don't just wipe your mouth with it. That's the least of its duties. Instead, you fold it, just so, before, during, and even after the meal. And if you think that sounds excessive, wait until we get to the how to drape it over your shoulder section. Napkins are presented in neatly folded stacks by servants at the beginning of the meal, often rolled or triangle folded depending on the household's tradition. Some were embroidered with initials, family crests, or if you're dining with royalty, the monarch's own symbols, just to remind you who's really wiping the gravy off your chin. Now, how do you use the status cloth? Carefully. To begin, you unfold it slowly. No flourishes, please. You lay it across your lap with a gentle flick, not a slap. This isn't a tablecloth wrestling competition. If you're of higher status, you may drape it over your shoulder instead. But be warned, only certain ranks can pull off the shoulder look without seeming ridiculous. You try it. It slips off. Everyone pretends not to notice. Mid-meal, you use the napkin to dab your lips. Dab, not wipe. Dabbing suggests delicacy. Wiping suggests you've been feeding yourself gravy, soaked pigeon. And whatever you do, don't blow your nose with it. That's not just rude. It's heretical. There are handkerchiefs for that, often silk, and even those come with their own etiquette manual. Quirky tidbit, alert, in some noble households, guests were judged not just on how they folded their napkins, but how they returned them. A poorly refolded napkin could be interpreted as an insult to the host's line and staff, or even the kitchen. Yes, that's right. You could offend someone with your laundry origami. Historians still argue whether the napkin draping customs varied significantly between regions or classes. But one thing is agreed upon: the napkin wasn't just for messes. It was performative. Like every gesture at the Tudor table, it showed you belonged. Let's say you finish a bite of quail stuffed with breadcrumbs and herbs, and a bit of juice glistens on your lower lip. Instinct says, grab napkin, wipe. Tudor rules say, lightly lift one corner of your napkin, bring it to your lips with pinky poised, and absorb, not smear, absorb, like you're gently blotting an oil painting. Next comes the silent bollet of the napkin between bites. You're not supposed to leave it untouched. That suggests you're ignoring the host's generous linen provisions, but using it too much makes you look either clumsy or gluttonous. There's a sweet spot somewhere between regal dabbing and a mop-up operation. You're aiming for aristocratic restraint, not barbecue night panic. Now let's talk folding during the meal. Every time you leave the table for a prayer break, a brief recess, or to refill your wine under strict servant supervision, you must refold the napkin and place it neatly on the table or your stool. Never just toss it down. That's what animals do. You're a human. A polite one. Your folded napkin, when left behind, speaks for you. It says, I'm coming back, or I'm done. Depending on its placement, a left side fold might mean pause. A neatly triangle folded napkin at your place setting could mean, this meal was divine. Of course, that's assuming the steward reading it understands your code. Tudor napkin folding was a bit like an interpretive dance. Everyone had their own style, and not all of it was intelligible. At the end of the meal, your final napkin fold is your parting bow. You smooth it out, fold it carefully, and either leave it beside your trencher or hand it discreetly to a servant, crumpling it into a ball. That'll earn you a spot below the salt at the next feast, if you're even invited. A mainstream historical fact worth folding into your mind: linen was so valuable in Tudor England that households were judged by the quality and cleanliness of their table linens. Nobles invested heavily in embroidered napkins, tablecloths, and towel sets, sometimes even displaying them in a napery cupboard purely for show. More napkins meant more wealth. And yes, this extended to your humble seat at the banquet. Your napkin was both tool and symbol, as much a part of the meal as the spiced lamprey pie or the gooseberry pudding. So here you sit, napkin in place, posture perfect, pretending you don't have gravy on your sleeve. You fold, refold, dab, and occasionally sigh when no one is looking. You've survived another Tudor table test. And just in time. Because what's that smell drifting in from the kitchen? More meat, more sauce, more rules. And oh, what you're gonna do with those leftover bones might just raise an eyebrow or three. By now, your fingers have mastered the delicate napkin ballet. Your lips have been dabbed into submission, and your social anxieties have simmered to a low, nervous hum. Just when you think you've gotten the hang of Tudor dining, you face the next bizarre twist: what to do with the scraps. The bones. The gristle. The half-chewed remnants of some unidentifiable creature that may or may not have once had feathers. Spoiler, you do not hide it under your plate. You don't discreetly toss it back onto the serving dish, and you definitely don't swallow it just to avoid the awkwardness. No. In true Tudor style, you drop it on the floor. Yes! The floor. It sounds like a trap, but this was completely normal. Even expected. The rushes covering the floor. Those bundles of straw, herbs, and seasonal flowers weren't just decorative. They were medieval dinner napkins, trash bins, and air fresheners all rolled into one. You simply lean slightly to the side, maintain eye contact with your goblet for discretion, and let that lamb knuckle fall gracefully to the ground. Voiled. You're suddenly part of history's least appetizing magic trick. This worked, of course, because servants and dogs, yes, actual dogs, would clean up after you. Well, trained spaniels and terriers roamed beneath the tables like canine vacuum cleaners, snapping up discarded morsels with a swiftness that would alarm modern restaurant inspectors. The wealthier the host, the more dogs on duty. And the better the rushes. Queen Elizabeth herself was rumored to favor rushes sprinkled with lavender and marjoram, because even her floor filth needed to smell divine. Your mainstream historical fact of the night: in Tudor England, floors were rarely bare. Fresh rushes were laid down regularly, often mixed with sweet, smelling herbs to mask odors and provide a kind of compostable carpet. It was a functional tradition stretching back to medieval times, though historians still argue whether rushes were replaced daily, weekly, or only when things got truly unbearable. The image of noble guests casually chucking bones under the table while sipping spiced wine might seem grotesque, but it was deeply embedded in the dining culture. There was even etiquette to how you dropped your scraps. You weren't supposed to fling them. That's peasant behavior. No, you performed a gentle drop, like setting a baby goose onto a soft pillow. Controlled, elegant, almost lazy. But wait, where do you not drop your bones? Ah, a crucial distinction. You never discard remains into someone else's area. The zone beneath your feet, yours. The stretch under your neighbor's stool, forbidden territory. Violating this invisible boundary could result in a very frosty exchange or, worse, an offended snort. And in Tudor times, a snort was practically a dual challenge. Quirky tidbit time. Some households used special bone trenchers or side dishes, usually for the wealthier guests. If you were lucky enough to have one, you'd place your bones there instead of the floor. It was a kind of luxury accessory, like the Elizabethan version of having a side plate just for lemon wedges. But these were rare, and most guests just aimed downward and hoped for the best. Let's say you've just finished a portion of eel pie, delicately seasoned, slightly squishy. You suck the last bit of meat from the bone, and now what? Here's what you don't do: place it back on your trencher. That's your edible plate, and mixing bones with bread is a major fox pass. You also don't sneak it into your sleeve, though rumor has it a particularly anxious baron once did just that and forgot about it until morning. His valet was not amused. Instead, you execute the floor drop, as practiced. You catch a glimpse of a passing spaniel, tail wagging, eyes locked onto your pigeon joint. It disappears within seconds. Efficient, loyal, slightly drooly. Truly, the unsung heroes of Tudor feasting. And let's not ignore the hierarchy even here. At the high table, scraps might be swept away by designated servants, armed with little brushes or rags. Lower down the hall, it's mostly dogs and dirt. But everyone participates in this shared unspoken dance of decay. It's what makes a Tudor banquet feel authentic. Historians still debate the exact degree of mess tolerated in these settings. Some sources paint noble feasts as pristine affairs, with attentive servants cleaning constantly. Others suggest a more relaxed, even riotous atmosphere, especially during seasonal feasts or celebrations. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the slop-scented middle. Now, here's a secret whispered down through dining halls. The real trick isn't just dropping bones. It's doing so with timing. You wait for a distraction. A toast, a loud laugh, the start of a lute song. That's when you make your move. Slide, drop, sip. Done. So here you are, surrounded by crushed herbs, a few very polite terriers, and a growing pile of aristocratic leftovers hidden beneath silk-clad legs. Somehow, the room still smells like rosemary and meat. You take another bite. Something chewy. Something foreign. Something that will undoubtedly end up at your feet before the hour's out, just when you think you've grasped the rhythm of Tudor feasting, dabbing, dropping, and delicately dabbling in conversation. A new challenge lands before you with suspicious gleam: the fork. Yes, a fork. That 2 or 3-pronged devil of a utensil that, in your modern world, is as innocent as a salad bar. But here, in Tudor England, it's a bold, almost blasphemous object. One that could earn you raised eyebrows, or worse, whispers about your foreign affectations. You eye it cautiously. The fork has made a slow, awkward crawl into English dining culture, mostly thanks to traveling nobles returning from Italy. Over there, in the Renaissance courts of Florence and Venice, forks are all the rage. Elegant, precise, a sign of refined table manners and wealth. But in England, still controversial, still suspect. Why, you ask? Because it looks too delicate, too dainty. Real men use knives and fingers. That's the prevailing opinion. Forks. They're for those fancy continentals who wear tights, sip weird wines, and probably kiss on both cheeks. Not good, solid Englishmen, with grease on their thumbs and pride in their palms. A mainstream historical fact for your supper: the fork didn't become widely accepted in England until well into the 17th century. Even Queen Elizabeth I is said to have preferred her fingers for most foods. While forks existed, imported by wealthy elites or diplomats, they were often treated like novelty items. Pretty sure. Practical. Debatable. In fact, many saw them as dangerous. Not just physically, because, yes, you could technically jab someone with a 2-pronged spike, but morally. Some sermons even linked fork usage with vanity and excess. God gave us fingers. The thinking went, so why act like a devil with a pitchfork at the dinner table? Quirky tidbit time. One early adopter of the fork in England was Thomas Coriat, a writer and traveler who brought one back from Italy in 1608. His fellow diners mocked him relentlessly. One critic said using a fork was affecting the Italian fashion too much, as if that were a crime punishable by banishment to the vegetable gardens. So here you are, a humble guest staring at this shiny instrument laid casually beside your knife. No one else touches it, not yet. And frankly, neither do you. Better to use your fingers. Clean from the hand washing, of course, and keep your reputation intact. But using fingers isn't as primitive as it sounds. There's an entire etiquette to how you use them. You don't just grab hunks of meat like a medieval raccoon. No, you pinch, tear delicately, and use the knife in tandem to assist. A well-trained Tudor diner can strip a quail down to bones without a single slurp or splash. And here's where it gets trickier. Certain dishes do encourage fork use, particularly ones with sauces. But even then, the fork is often seen as a helper, not a lead utensil. You might use it to steady something as you cut it, or to twirl up noodles. Yes, they had pasta, but stabbing and lifting. Too theatrical, too Italian. Historians still argue whether the fork's early usage in Tudor England was more widespread among women, who were expected to keep their fingers clean and avoid unseemly mess, or if it remained a rare, regional novelty. Either way, if you're using one tonight, you'd better be quiet about it. You decide to pass. For now. Better to follow the crowd and use your knife and fingers with practiced discretion. One hand holds the meat, the other slices delicately. You avoid licking your fingers. Absolutely forbidden. And instead reach once again for your napkin. Dab, fold, set down. Yet your curiosity remains. Across the table, a noblewoman daintily uses her fork to sample a pear poached in wine. She does it with such ease, such quiet rebellion, that you wonder if this is the future. The way trends begin. Softly, fork first, from the fingertips of the daring. But daring has its cost. You hear someone mutter about her European airs. Another frowns. You chew your lamb quietly and pretend not to notice. Safer that way. And it is easier to eat with fingers. Especially when the dishes are designed for it. Spiced pies you can hold. Game birds torn gently apart. Even custards come in scoopable pastry shells. The Tudor table isn't a place for fussing. It's a place for demonstrating control. Still, the fork gleams beside your plate, mocking you, tempting you. Not tonight, you decide. Tonight you survive. The meat is juicy, the sauce rich, and your hands. Finally, no longer tremble each time you reach for your trencher. You've managed to keep your social flubs to a minimum, your scraps mostly in your designated floor zone, and your napkin relatively unscandalous. But now comes the silent enforcer of Tudor table etiquette, your posture. You sit straight, not rigid, not slouched, just straight enough to suggest you have a spine and a modicum of self-discipline. This, in Tudor England, is a performance in itself. Your back isn't just a body part, it's a statement. One that says, I wasn't raised by wolves. I'm at least 3 degrees removed from the mud, farming classes. From the moment the grace was muttered, to the first, unsteady spoonful, every eye has been measuring how upright you are. Slouching, leaning on your elbows, or, heaven forbid, resting your chin in your hand. You may as well crawl under the table with the dogs. Children of noble households were drilled in proper dining posture from a terrifyingly young age. It wasn't just a matter of appearance. It was about moral character. Sit up, and you're disciplined. Slouch, and you're probably plotting something. And posture was just the start. Let's talk about chewing. A seemingly simple act, yet so fraught with danger here that you wonder how anyone ever made it through a bite. The key rule: chew quietly, very quietly. You're aiming for total oral invisibility. Any smacking, slurping, or audible chomping will earn you glares sharp enough to butter bread. That's not food. Those are your social prospects dissolving in soup. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Tudor manners emphasized restraint and self-control at all times, reflecting broader religious and social ideologies of the period. Table behavior was seen as a microcosm of one's soul. If you couldn't control your jaw, how could you be trusted with estate management or foreign diplomacy? It sounds absurd now, but there were actually conduct manuals advising readers to chew on one side of the mouth only, lest they look beastly. And if you happen to have bad teeth, as many Tudors did, thanks to sugar, you were expected to chew so carefully that no tooth ever made contact with another. That's right. Chew like a mime. A quirky tidbit for your sleepy brain. Some hosts used whispering trumpets. Actual long metal tubes to deliver silent corrections to poor posture or etiquette across a long banquet hall. A servant would lean in and, through the pipe, gently inform a guest that their elbows had crept too far onto the table. Subtle. Not at all. Effective. Absolutely. Now, let's say you've just taken a bite of something questionable. Maybe the stew had a hint of fermented turnip. Maybe it was eel again. You can't grimace. That's rule number 400. No visible signs of disgust. You keep your face as serene as a stained glass saint and chew with what you hope is silent nobility. And here's where it gets even more theatrical. You're not supposed to look like you're chewing. The trick, small bites. Close your lips fully. Move your jaw only slightly. It's the closest a human can come to eating like a mannequin. You're essentially performing a very quiet magic trick with roast duck and restraint. Historians still argue whether such intense scrutiny of chewing and posture was common across all classes or mostly confined to noble and courtly settings. Some records suggest that outside the royal court, things were looser, livelier, even rowdy. But here, in the glow of candelabras and the shadow of the salt, every movement is monitored. You shift slightly in your seat, careful to keep your spine in line. You catch sight of a young lordling across the hall, jabbing at his food with such vigor you hear a tiny clang. His mother visibly winces. Someone murmurs, "Too much French influence," which in Tudor England is basically the worst insult short of heretic, and don't even think about yawning. Tired. Too bad. Bored. Hide it. Your jaw must remain shut unless it's nibbling or offering humble thanks. If your mouth opens wide for any reason not involving a bite of meat, you'll be remembered. Not kindly. There's also a strange unspoken rule about sighing. You may sigh once. Softly. A wistful breath over the wine cup is fine, poetic even. But sigh more than twice, and you risk being labeled melancholic, which in Tudor psychology is dangerously close to madness or worse, French poetry. You settle your shoulders. Straighten your back, chew like a Tudor saint. Breathe like a damp cathedral. You've made it through soup and peasant and 3 varieties of oddly spiced pudding, and you're still socially intact. And in this strange rule-bound world of whispers and folded napkins, that's the biggest win of all. Just when you think you've conquered the art of chewing like a church mouse and sitting like a marble statue, Tudor dining throws you a wonderfully gross curveball, bodily functions. Specifically, the fact that some were perfectly acceptable at the table and others were, well, banishable offenses. Let's start with the big one, spitting. Yes, you read that right. In Tudor England, spitting was not just tolerated, it was practically built into the furniture. Fancy tables sometimes came equipped with discreet containers called spittoons, and servants would often place a bowl nearby for just this purpose. You could turn your head, cover your mouth, and quietly expel your unwanted bits, gristle, phlegm, or who knows what, into the designated bowl. There were, of course, rules. You couldn't just let one fly across the room like a trebuchet. You had to do it politely, controlled, downward, into a cloth or bowl. No fanfare. The goal was to keep the act invisible, or at least inaudible. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. Public spitting was commonplace in most European societies well into the 18th century. Even royalty did it. It was seen as a natural bodily function, no more shameful than blinking. The idea that it was impolite didn't really take hold until later, when medical understanding and social norms shifted toward cleaner, more civilized behavior. But Tudor England had its limits. You could spit, yes, but belching. Now you were entering dangerous territory. The rules around burping were oddly inconsistent. A discreet, quiet belch, if utterly unavoidable, might be forgiven with a muttered pardon, but a loud, hearty one, that was vulgar. Undignified. The kind of thing that might earn you an arched eyebrow and a permanent spot below the salt. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some noble circles, it was considered polite to turn and cough to mask a burp, rather than trying to hold it in and risk internal distress, as one etiquette manual daintily put it. So if your neighbor suddenly begins coughing violently, it might not be plague, It might just be goose pie. Now let's talk nose blowing. Another field of peril. There are napkins, yes, but they are not for your nose. Handkerchiefs exist, but using them at the table is delicate business, the ideal. Excuse yourself. Step aside. Blow in private. But if you must do it at the table, use the handkerchief discreetly and do not, under any circumstances, inspect it afterward. That was considered barbaric. One may cleanse the nose, one writer warned, but one must not study the harvest. The same goes for sneezing. You may sneeze. You must cover. And then you must murmur a prayer, or at least an excuse me. Loud sneezes were generally tolerated better than laughter, which tells you everything about Tudor priorities. Historians still argue whether these bodily norms shifted significantly between town and country. In more rural settings, the rules were often relaxed. But in noble halls, especially with royalty present, these behaviors could define how you were remembered, or forgotten, or exiled to the table near the kitchen door. And then there's scratching. Now, no one's pretending that Tudor clothing was comfortable. You're swaddled in layers, linen, wool, maybe even fur if you're highborn, and it itches constantly. But scratching, you must resist, or at least fake your scratch in a socially acceptable way. The trick is to shift, adjust. Let your movement imply you're merely rearranging your layers, not clawing at a flea bite. And yes, flea bites were a real issue. Everyone had them, but only the undignified acknowledged them publicly. Oddly enough, flatulence gets almost no mention in Tudor etiquette books. It's the ghost rule. Everyone knew it happened, but no one wrote about it. The implication, if it occurred, you ignored it. Immediately, no eye contact, no giggling, absolute silence. If the queen lets one slip, you pretend the lute player hit a sour note. Now let's say you witness a violation. A neighbor sneezes directly into his trencher or wipes his nose on the tablecloth. Do you react? Not unless you want to seem as vulgar as he is. The polite response is to notice nothing. Look away. Perhaps smile at your goblet. And definitely do not, under any circumstances, discuss it later. There's a peculiar dignity in pretending everything's fine when it so clearly is not. It's very Tudor, very English. And so you sit, your belly full, your posture perfect, your nose mercifully dry. A dog sneezes under the table, and no one flinches. A knight belches into his sleeve, and earns a slight nod of acknowledgement from a bishop. You begin to understand this isn't just about food. It's about control, about performing civilization with a spoon in one hand and a napkin in the other. And yet, you kind of miss the fork. You're halfway through your second helping of rabbit stew, surreptitiously plucking bones into the shadows of your trenchers. When you catch something out of the corner of your eye, a sly movement, a hand darting like a thief scoops up the salt cellar and subtly nudges it closer to their plate. Salt. Again, it's not just seasoning here. It's status, remember? And to hoard it, to sneak extra pinches or monopolize the cellar, that's like pulling rank with a pepper shaker. Only ruder. Welcome to the clandestine crimes of Tudor dining, the subtle, scandalous little misdemeanors committed right there on the linen. Salt was valuable. Like, actually valuable. Wars weren't fought over it exactly, but economies were shaped by it. The term salary comes from the Latin salarium, wages once partially paid in salt. So when someone stealthily drags the salt cellar their way, everyone notices. They just pretend not to. You watch as the salt thief sprinkles far more than necessary over their Yule tart. Someone whispers. Someone else smirks. The gesture doesn't need a word. It's all theater. All signal. This is the world of sauce stealing and salt crimes, where the smallest gestures shout the loudest. See, Tudor meals weren't about personal portions. Most dishes were shared. Meat sliced communally. Sauces pooled in the middle for all to dip. But etiquette demanded you dip from your side only, using your bread, not your fingers, and certainly not with the greedy precision of someone reaching across the trenchers. Breaking that rule. Oh, it's deliciously scandalous. Let's say you're eyeing the green sauce, something herby, vinegary, probably parsley based, and your neighbor's bread is already perched perilously close. You hesitate, you know your lane, you dip your corner. But then Lord Cuthbert, high cheekbones, low morals, leans over and boldly dunks his whole hunk of manchet right into your sauce zone. The room doesn't gasp, it does worse. It notices. And that is Tudor punishment in its purest form, silent, withering observation. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Shared sauces and seasonings were a staple of Tudor dining, but strict rules governed their use. Personal utensils were rare, and double dipping could mark you as uncouth or unclean. Instead, guests were trained to use bread to gather small amounts, consuming both bread and sauce in a single tidy motion. Quirky tidbit. There were known cases of people being quietly removed from dinner rotations. Ghosted, if you will, after committing too many condiment-related infractions. One nobleman's diary from 1583 mentions a guest who kept too long the custard spoon and was never invited again. The sauce spillers weren't the only threats. Bread thieves were a breed unto themselves. The finest manchet, soft, white, beautifully baked, was a luxury, and when left unattended, even for a prayer or a cough, it could mysteriously vanish. Some guests even brought decoy bread to swap out, hoarding the good stuff under their sleeves or behind goblets. Yes, Tudor's slate of hand existed, and it was deliciously petty. And then there were the drip offenders, those who ladled too heavily from communal dishes, letting stews slosh across the table. This, too, was a breach. It disrespected the steward's careful plating, the cloth, and your neighbor's hunger. Historians still argue whether these dining crimes were ever formally punished or merely socially condemned, but the consensus is clear. A well-behaved guest knew how to blend in. A food criminal. They stood out. And not in the good way. You begin to realize, with a mix of admiration and dread, just how intricate this dance really is. Every move, every bite is political. Social. Charged with nuance. You're not just eating. You're performing a role, one where even reaching for the wrong crust might imply ambition, disrespect, or worse, ignorance. Suddenly, you understand why the nobility trained their children in table manners like knights trained for jests. It wasn't just about appearances. It was about survival. You reach for a fresh piece of bread, slowly, confidently. You dip into your half of the shared mustard, just a smidge, and raise it to your lips with a poise that would make your etiquette tutor weep. You catch someone watching, they nod. Maybe. Or maybe they're just wondering where the salt went. The courses keep coming, each more extravagant than the last. By now, you've nibbled on lark pie, stared nervously at something jellied and inexplicably purple, and managed not to spill anything on your doublet. Just as you think you've earned a moment of quiet victory, a cup is pressed into your hand. A goblet, to be exact, brimming with all... drinking at last. Simple, right? Wrong. Welcome to the twisted maze of Tudor drinking etiquette, where even taking a sip involves strategy, status, and surprisingly high odds of embarrassment. First, the rules of the cup. There's a specific ritual to toasting, one that's equal parts homage and hazard. You don't just lift your goblet and shout, "Cheers." No, you await the signal, usually a nod or a spoken cue from the host. Then, and only then, do you rise slightly, but not fully, and sip. Always a sip. Never a gulp. The host begins. His goblet is lifted, acknowledged with a collective murmur from the guests, and drained, modestly, of course. Each guest follows, in order of rank, not enthusiasm. You don't toast out of turn. That's like crashing a wedding speech at a royal ceremony. You wait, and then you mimic. Your mainstream historical fact alcohol, mostly all mead and wine, was a standard part of Tudor dining, not just for pleasure, but necessity. Water was often unsafe to drink, so low alcohol all became the beverage of choice, even for children. However, formal meals came with drinking protocols that mirrored military drill precision. Quirky tidbit: some nobles had personalized goblets, engraved, jeweled, even perfumed inside with citrus or cloves. The fancier the cup, the slower the sip. If you're holding something that looks like it belongs in a treasure chest, don't chug. You cradle it like a sacred relic and sip like it holds secrets. Now, say you're handed a goblet mid-meal. You're not sure who offered it, but etiquette says you must acknowledge. Eye contact is key. You glance at the giver, raise your glass slightly, and drink. Then, and this is crucial, you offer a nod of thanks or a whispered, "I drink to your good health." Failure to respond. Rude. Failure to reciprocate later. Unforgivable. Which brings us to reciprocation. If someone toasts to you, you owe them a return toast before the meal ends. Forget to do this, and you might as well spill your wine down your front and call yourself disgraced. And yes, there's an unspoken ranking system. You toast upward in status, downward only if invited. Now imagine this scenario. A knight 3 seats over raises his goblet and toasts to your excellent restraint during the eel course. It's a clear social challenge. You must reply, soon, cleverly, and without fumbling your goblet like a drunk acrobat. You smile, lift your goblet, and murmur something appropriately flattering. And to your unrivaled knowledge of sauces, there, safe, slightly witty, toast returned. The drinking itself must remain controlled. The Tudor ideal is moderation. The host wants guests relaxed, not roaring. A little wine loosened the tongue, encouraged polite conversation, and signaled camaraderie. Too much. You become that guest, the one who laughs too loudly, spills things, forgets the difference between sauce bowls and chamber pots. Historians still argue whether Tudor meals regularly devolved into drunken debauchery, or if such excesses were the exception. Diaries and court records suggest that while many feasts included heavy drinking, the most formal affairs maintained their strict decorum, with a few notable exceptions involving disgraced courtiers and unfortunate fountains. There's even a rule for how you drink. Don't stare into the cup. It suggests suspicion. Don't look away from the table. It implies disinterest. The perfect sip happens with eyes cast downward in contemplation or upward in quiet gratitude. Think saint, not sailor. One last rule, don't drain the cup dry. That's considered greedy, and it puts pressure on the servants to refill it immediately, creating unnecessary bustle. You want to leave a little behind, a symbolic nod to abundance, generosity, and the fact that you know when to stop. Of course, not everyone follows these rules. Across the hall, a minor noble has just toasted for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. His goblet wobbles dangerously. He winks at a duchess and sloshes wine onto his sleeve. A servant materializes, cloth in hand, eyes rolled so hard they may never return to their sockets. You, on the other hand, sip serenely. Well, not wine, safer, smoother, and less likely to betray you. You offer a quiet toast to your neighbor, a bishop's cousin with kind eyes and very sharp cheekbones. He nods back, you're learning. Slowly, sip by sip. And as the goblets make their rounds, clinking and murmuring through the hall, you begin to feel a strange warmth. Not just from the alcohol, but from the quiet rhythm of the ritual. The shared drink, the silent agreements, the soft, flickering glow of civility in a room full of humans doing their best not to burp. The candles are burning low, the air thick with roasted meats and lavender-scented rushes, and you're still seated somehow as the Tudor feast stretches on, and on, and on. This, dear sleeper, is no ordinary supper. You've landed yourself at a royal meal, and royal meals don't simply happen. They unfold, a culinary marathon punctuated by ceremony, spectacle, and small talk so delicate it might shatter under its own politeness. And here's the thing, you're nowhere near the finish line. Tudor royal feasts, particularly those hosted by Henry or Elizabeth I, could last upwards of 6 hours, sometimes even longer. We're talking dozens of courses, each paraded into the hall with trumpet fanfare, announced by title. Yes, the dishes had names, and often served with side performances. Want to eat your pie? Cool. But first, please enjoy this lute solo, and a pageant involving a dancing bear. Your mainstream historical fact: royal meals during the Tudor period were highly structured affairs. The day's main meal, usually served in the early afternoon, could include up to 30 courses, depending on the occasion. These weren't just about nourishment, they were political theater showcasing wealth, power, and the divine favor of the monarchy. By this point in the feast, your jaw aches from polite chewing, your back is a rigid monument to medieval ergonomics, and your napkin has been folded and refolded into at least 3 different heraldic animals. But the food keeps coming. And not just food, spectacles. One course might be a giant pie, its crust broken open to reveal live birds fluttering out. Another might feature a roast boar with an apple in its mouth and gold leaf on its ears. There's an entire section of the table just for subtleties. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles, dragons, and historical scenes reenacted in marzipan. You half expect a reenactment of the Battle of Bosworth to rise up in jelly form. Quirky tidbit time. At one legendary banquet, a roast peacock was served dressed in its own feathers, with a functioning miniature fountain spouting rose water from its beak. Guests were instructed to admire it, not eat it, though someone reportedly tried anyway and was never seen again. Coincidence? Maybe. This isn't just about indulgence. Every dish, every decoration carries meaning. A swan symbolizes purity. A hedgehog, yes. A hedgehog might be served as a sign of cleverness. The more obscure the symbolism, the better. If you don't get the joke, well, you've just outed yourself as an undereducated guest. The room grows warmer. Not from affection, but from the sheer number of bodies, torches, and covered dishes emitting steam. The servants are flagging, their once crisp linen now slightly wilted. But the protocol endures. No dish can be served without the proper introductions, the proper bow, the proper procession. You try to pace yourself, but it's hard. Tudor dishes aren't light. You've had pies stuffed with livers and nuts, sausages coiled like sleeping snakes, fish molded into the shape of birds, and birds disguised as fish. Your stomach no longer knows which kingdom it's digesting. And then there's the drinking schedule. Every few courses, someone toasts. Every toast demands a response. You've lost track of how many good healths you've endured, but your goblet seems magically refilled every time you blink. It's less a cup and more a test of yourself. Restraint. Historians still argue whether the sheer length and grandeur of Tudor royal feasts served practical purposes, like appeasing nobles or displaying abundance to foreign envoys, or whether they were mostly for ego. Henry VI, for example, was known to plan menus personally, ensuring that certain dishes appeared purely to impress or intimidate specific guests. As a guest, your job is to remain composed, even as your belt quietly contemplates surrender. Even as the roast venison is replaced with a mysterious blanc mange that somehow tastes like both almond and despair. You chew, you nod, you praise the cook, you consider taking a short nap under the table, just until the next pie. But sleep is not allowed, because now come the presentations. Servants step forward holding elaborately wrapped gifts, small tokens meant to accompany certain dishes. A guest of honor might receive a perfumed glove with a stuffed quail, or a miniature harp with a tart. You get a sugared walnut in a gold foiled twist. Not bad. The monarch, seated high on their dais, is mostly quiet, eating very little, drinking even less. Their presence alone is feast enough. You steal a glance up the table and catch Elizabeth dabbing her lips with a cloth so fine, it might actually be spider silk. The final few courses are sweet, though sweet, by Tudor standards, means heavily spiced, often peppered, and sometimes inexplicably meaty. There's a plum custard that tastes faintly of cloves and nostalgia, and a layered cake that looks like it's seen battle. By the time the final platter is cleared, and the last prayer of thanks is murmured, you are no longer sure of your name, only that you have survived something monumental, an endurance test, a rite of passage. A medieval food marathon with polite applause instead of medals. You sit back, if sitting back is still physically possible, and feel your eyelids dip. Your fingers twitch toward your napkin. Your breath slows, and yet, there's one last act to play. The eating is done. The trenchers have been cleared, the goblets emptied, and the musicians have gently transitioned from lively reels to softer, string-laden melodies that feel more like lullabies than courtly entertainment. The hard part's over, right? Wrong? Now comes the most treacherous part of the feast, leaving. You don't just get up and go. There's no thanks for dinner. See you next jest. This is Tudor England, where even your exit is judged and potentially weaponized. You must depart with grace, humility, and just the right amount of flair. Not too much, not too little. Just enough to be remembered as tastefully dignified, not desperately theatrical. First, you wait for a signal, usually from the host or the highest-ranking guest. They rise slowly, regally, perhaps with a tiny groan hidden beneath their ruffled collar, and then the rest of the table follows, like obedient human dominoes. You do not, under any circumstances, rise first. That's social mutiny. You place your napkin, folded, of course, either on your seat or to the left of your trencher. There's no universal law about napkin placement at this point, but tradition leans toward symbolism. On the seat, I had a delightful time. By the trencher, thank you for feeding me and not judging my chewing too harshly. Your mainstream historical fact here. In formal Tudor dining, guests were expected to leave the table in a specific order, reflecting their rank. The most important guests exited first, often escorted by servants or musicians, followed in sequence down to the least ranking attendees. This procession reinforced the strict social hierarchy, even in farewells. As you rise, your limbs creak in protest. You've been sitting for hours, perched on a bench with all the give of a stone altar. But you don't stretch. Don't crack your back. You glide. That's what's expected. Think gliding ghost more than aging tourist. And now, the farewell gestures. You bow. You curtsy. You give a slight nod to the host, murmuring a phrase of thanks so old-fashioned it may as well be in Latin. Something like, "My lord, your table has been a bounty of heaven." You say this while backing away, because, yes, you don't just turn and walk off like a tavern goer. You retreat with reverence. This is where it gets tricky. Say you passed sauce correctly, didn't slouch too much, and even remembered to toast Lady Margaret after she toasted your graceful trenchering. You're riding high, but then you forget to bow to the footman who opened the hall door for you. Scandal. Yes, even the servants are part of the ritual, not because you're equals. Heavens, no, but because acknowledging them, even briefly, signals your understanding of the social machine. You say a soft thank you or offer a respectful nod to the steward. The silent ones remember. And in Tudor society, a well-remembered guest could be a reinvited guest. Quirky tidbit, in some noble houses, guests were gifted parting favors. Tiny pouches of sugar plums, gloves perfumed with rose oil, or, for special occasions, miniature hand, illustrated verses praising the host. These tokens weren't just sweet, they were strategic. A well-worded verse might show up in court gossip the next day. Now, as you approach the exit, your final challenge awaits the hall watchers. These are the folks who didn't get a seat at the feast, but still linger in the outer corridors. Servants, lesser relatives, musicians not currently strumming. They're observing, judging, whispering. If you trip, yawn, or belch in the doorway, they'll remember. And stories spread faster than trenchers at a pudding course. Historians still argue whether these silent observers played any formal role in court records or gossip, but plenty of period diaries reference the looks in the hallway, or the steward's wink. The implication, what happens after the feast matters just as much as what happens during it. You make it through, somehow, you bow to a knight, nod to a lady in waiting, even give a small wink to the dog who's been faithfully cleaning beneath your feet all night. He blinks once. Approval granted. You step outside into the cool air, the muffled sounds of the hall fading behind you. You've eaten, spoken, toasted, survived. Not once did you spill your drink, sneeze into the soup, or knock over the salt. You walk into the night not just full, but triumphant. And possibly slightly tipsy. And back in the hall, another guest slips on an eel bone and lands in a tureen of quince jelly. You sigh. You made it out just in time. Outside the banquet hall, the stars have shifted overhead. The moon, now high and pale, casts silver onto the cobbled courtyard as you stagger just slightly. Dignified, of course, into the fresh air. The feast is over, but your mind still echoes with the clink of goblets, the whisper of linen, and the rustle of gossip-laced laughter. Yet even here, beyond the firelight, your Tudor dining journey isn't quite finished. Because leaving a feast isn't just about getting out, it's about how you leave. The memory you imprint on your hosts and fellow guests. It's the Tudor version of a Yelp review, written not in stars but in subtle bows, folded napkins, and well, timed exits. You take one last look back at the glowing windows. From here, the great hall is a blur of flickering candles and ghostly movement. Musicians still play, softly now, easing the remaining guests into their final courses, likely sugared violets and little spiced biscuits that taste like lavender dreams and mild regret. Then you hear it murmuring. Quiet voices in shadowed corners. Servants, yes, but more than that. Gossip. This is the network beneath the meal, the part of Tudor dining you never officially see but are always part of. Servants move silently between chambers, whispering what Lady Anne said to Lord whomever. How Sir Godfrey dipped too greedily into the red sauce, how that quiet guest, you, managed not to commit any major foxpaths. You hope these aren't just idle whispers. In a world where reputation is as valuable as gold, these backroom murmurs matter. Historians still argue whether these servant observations ever directly influenced court decisions, but there's ample evidence that nobles cultivated their reputations carefully, sometimes even bribing household staff to ensure a glowing post-dinner narrative, and sometimes these whispers became poetry, literal poetry. Courtiers would commission verses describing the elegance of the feast, the charm of the guests, the majesty of the roast boar. These little rhymes circulated in letters or read aloud at smaller gatherings where Tudor Yelp meets Instagram captions. Except with more rhyming couplets and fewer hashtags, you overhear a snatch of such a verse being recited now. Soft, drunken syllables floating down from a balcony. His spoon did glide with saintly grace, no pottage stained his powdered face. You pause. Could they be talking about you? Another layer to this tale coded messages, not just gossip, but intelligence. For Tudor nobles, especially those with court ambitions, banquets were battlegrounds for alliances. A shared trencher, with the right baron, could signal favor. A passed cup might hide a note folded into the napkin, carefully opened later by candlelight, reed burned. Quirky tidbit, there's at least one recorded case of a message being hidden inside a pie. Not a note on the crust, no, inside the actual pie. The recipient was supposed to cut deep, retrieve it, and pretend nothing unusual had happened. Tudor espionage was deliciously absurd. As you drift farther from the hall, your thoughts swirl with the strange beauty of it all, the pageantry, the paranoia, the peppered pudding, and you realize you've changed. You arrived as a guest. You leave as a survivor. You endured the salt lines and sauce politics. You dodged the spittoon stumbles and fork fox pass. You folded your napkin with the quiet precision of a Lenin ninja and toasted exactly the right people with exactly the right amount of eye contact. And now, you glide into the night like a pro, soft-footed, belly full, ego lightly seasoned. But before your mind can drift entirely into dreams of manchette bread and mild scandal, the rhythm of the night begins to slow. The air cools, the wind hushes, your pulse, once attuned to the frantic pageantry of Tudor civility, begins to settle. The feast fades. The flickering candles dim behind distant windows. The whispers dissolve into stillness. Your journey through Tudor table manners has ended, not with a bang, but with a folded napkin, a final bow, and the gentle hush of nighttime history. So now, let it all melt away. Let the clatter of pewter and whispered toasts drift off like candle smoke. Let your spine uncurl from that careful posture and ease into something soft, something quiet. You've played your part in a Tudor dining hall, walked the tightrope of etiquette, and emerged unscathed. Feel the air grow cooler. Let the memory of herbs crushed beneath slippered feet bring you calm. You're no longer holding your cup just so, no longer calculating the correct angle of your napkin fold. Now, you're just breathing, and with each breath, the hall grows further away, the music slows, the golden light dims, the rushes are gone, and all that's left is hush. The hush of a time long past, of rules no longer needed, of roles no longer worn. You're safe now, and sleepy. Let go of the lords and the ladies, the sauces and scandals. Let your mind sink into that warm, velvety dark where history becomes lullaby, where the rules slip away like crumbs brushed gently from linen. You've dined like a Tudor. You've walked their walk. And now, it's time to rest.